Hello, everyone. I'm Marty Hurst from the School of Information, and it's my great pleasure to, hello, Gerard, to introduce Paul Niehaus, who is an associate professor of economics at UCSD. And I'm going to read my little summary here. So Paul does work at the intersection of development and technology with a particular focus on helping with governments in emerging markets, helping them improve the implementation of social programs. His research makes contributions to both theoretical and applied questions, and it's noteworthy in its direct and ambitious engagement with frontline policymakers. Alongside his academic research, Paul is a co-founder of Segovia Technology and Give Directly, which is an innovative nonprofit that helps donors give money directly to people in need. So Paul has actually been named one of Foreign Policy's 100 leading global thinkers. So we'll let him disambiguate if that's thinking about the globe or thinking globally. So today, Paul is going to talk to us about identity verification standards in welfare programs, which is an ambitious effort to implement biometric identification with over 15 million beneficiaries in India. So Paul's willing to take questions as he speaks, as long as they're polite. So let's give him a polite welcome.
All right. Thank you so much. Guys, thanks for having me. It's awesome to be here. And you hear me okay in the back? I think we're mic'd up, right? So that helps a little bit. You hear me okay? Yeah, good. So I know it's a pretty diverse crowd, and so as you just heard, please stop me at any point if there's something that doesn't make sense, something that's unclear. That's great. I'd love to talk about that stuff. So I'm going to talk today about joint work with Karthik and Sandeep, who are two longtime collaborators of mine, and so hopefully we'll get a chance to talk both about this specific project, but also give you some sense of how the context, or how that fits into our longer-term vision and research agenda for work in India, looking specifically at the reform of India's welfare state and its subsidy regime, which is ongoing. So for context on today's talk, the kind of problem fundamentally that we want to think about today is the question of what should citizens have to do in order to prove that they are who they say they are when they interact with the state. And that's, of course, a problem that comes up in a whole bunch of different contexts. One that we often talk about is in the context of voting. So the question of what should people have to prove in order to vote, and we worry about whether different changes in the thresholds are going to have an impact on how often different demographic groups turn out to vote, what's fair, what those standards should be. Today we're going to think specifically about the problem of access to welfare programs. So what should you have to do in order to prove that you are in fact someone who's been identified as eligible for a program? So that will be our focus today. But across all these problems, there's some degree of common structure in the sense that in all of these contexts, what we're doing from a design standpoint is trading off two kinds of errors, right? Errors of inclusion, where we grant access to benefits or to rights to people who were not in fact entitled to those, and errors of exclusion, right, where we deny access to benefits to people who were in fact entitled to those. And so that will be our focus today. I wanted to flag here just right away on slide one a couple of related and important but distinct issues that we're not going to be talking about today. So one of these is sort of proving not who you are, but what your type is. So in the design of anti-problems in particular, there's often a two-step process where I first demonstrate, for example, that I'm poor to qualify for the program. And then when I show up to collect my benefits, I prove to you that I am the person that you previously identified as poor in order to collect those benefits, right? And so we're going to be focusing today on that second step in the process, but we're not going to be looking at the first. That is something that I've worked on and that Karthik and Sandeep and I've worked on together as well, so it's a very important problem, but that's not going to be today. And then the second is we're going to be looking at the application of an ID scheme, a very important one. When you think about a system for establishing identity, in addition to questions like the ones we're going to look at today, it also raises a bunch of really deep and important questions about privacy and about power in society. Questions like, if the government can now piece together a lot of different bits of information about me, does that give it too much power relative to me, and how do we navigate those boundaries? Those are important issues, and they're very controversial issues in the context that I'm going to be talking about today, but again, not something that we're going to get deep into, but not because they're not important. So these issues, this sort of question of navigating areas of inclusion and exclusion, have been particularly salient in developing countries, and particularly salient as of late. And I think a lot of this is, to oversimplify somewhat, is because there are a lot of countries around that are managing fairly substantial welfare states, but with very limited state capacity, right? In sort of a high level of abstraction. And so that's led to a surge of investment in new ID schemes around the world. And I tried to give you some sense here of what some of these are. This is true historically if you look at sort of what do states do as they develop. Even simple things like establishing naming conventions that everybody should have both a first and a last name. These are often things that come along because states need a reliable means of figuring out with whom they are interacting. Over the last 2 decades, I think the kind of definitive book on this right now is Gelb and Metz, and so I give you a quote from them. In addition to there being a lot of national impetus for these schemes, there's also a lot of private and international backing for this. So the World Bank has an initiative, the ID4D development initiative, ID4 development initiative, kind of subsidizing and encouraging work in this area. JPAL has just, with funding from the Gates Foundation, launched an initiative called Digify Africa, which is in many ways, I think, trying to kind of carry over some of the lessons that we've learned from our work in India and kind of do some of the same kind of work in Africa. So there's a lot of kind of institutional impetus and momentum behind all of these stuff. And an important feature of these is that a lot of these, the majority of these around the world, use biometric technology to authenticate people. And so there are various reasons for that, but I think one of the important reasons and rationales you often hear is that we're working in settings where some of the other settings of low numeracy and literacy, where some of the other approaches that we might typically use for authentication, things like two-factor, getting a text message or using a password, things like that, we think may not work as well. So here's a map to give you some sense of what this looks like around the world. Dark blue here are countries that have a sort of countrywide application, like a national ID. Lighter blue, at least one state or ministry level application. Light blue, at least one project level application. Right? So just to give you a sense of where around the world this is happening. We're going to be looking today specifically at India. And I would think of India as being a sort of leading and unusual and important sort of example of everything that I've just said to you. So a few years ago, India gave the green light to the Aadhaar project. This is the largest biometric or largest ID project anywhere in the world. Aadhaar is Hindi for foundation, and so part of what is unusual from a design standpoint about the Aadhaar initiative is that it's extremely light, right? So at the end of the day, what the Aadhaar service provides is that if I send to you an ID number and biometric information, like a scan of someone's fingerprints, it'll send me back a single bit, like a yes or a no. It'll tell me whether those two things match. And so the government's vision here was not to provide you, in addition, with access to demographic information or information about whether you're entitled to vote or all these kinds of things, but to really strip out everything except the essence of the identity problem and provide that in a very scaled way, and then build a bunch of other stuff on top of it. Right? So that's why they use this word foundation for it. And they've been strikingly successful at doing this. So right now, about 1 in 7 people on the planet have an Aadhaar ID as of this fall. So it's a big deal, and its application to programming, sort of actually then taking it and using it and building those additional service layers on top of it, has been very, very controversial. Right? So there are a bunch of these happening, sort of at least 5,500 use cases as of 2017, and depending on who you ask, this is either a wonderful thing or a terrible thing. And so I've tried to give you a sense of the range of perspectives here. The government, when it first introduced this, really touted it as a game changer for governance. And a big part of what they had in mind there was the ability to cut out leakage and errors of inclusion, right? Benefits going to people who weren't meant to get them, to corrupt middlemen, these sorts of things. And critics, who I think have tended to be focused much more on the risk of areas of exclusion, have worried that this is actually going to deny people access to benefits to which they're entitled. In some cases, benefits that are literally life-saving, which is why Ritika Kara, who's an economist and an activist, is concerned that this potentially undermines the right to life. And the Supreme Court just recently ruled on this. So there was a big debate about whether or not the government could in fact make Aadhaar authentication mandatory for access to social program benefits, and they said that they could, right? And so from our perspective, that makes it all the more urgent to understand what the impacts of doing so are. We're going to look at the application in particular to the public distribution system in India. So the public distribution system is the single biggest component of India's welfare state, and it's the centerpiece of their efforts to fight malnutrition. India has more malnourished people than any other country in the world today. That's in part because India has a lot of people, but it is also because the rates are very bad, and in particular for children. So it's a big problem. The way the fair price or the public distribution system works is through the maintenance of a network of fair price shops or ration shops. There are about 500,000 of these around the country. And people who are eligible to participate in the program can show up at these each month to purchase a certain quantity of subsidized food, mostly food grains and a few other commodities, which I'll tell you about. And one of the big issues historically has been leakage. So the last nationally representative numbers we have, which come from the 2011 to 2012 round of the National Household Survey, we estimated that about 40% of all the grain the government was distributing through this system, which, by the way, I think is about a third of all food grains procured in India, was going missing at some point in the chain. Right? So it's been a first-order issue for welfare in India for a while. In this paper, what we're going to do is evaluate the impact of biometric authentication in the PDS through a partnership with the state of Jharkhand. We're going to work with the government of Jharkhand to randomize the rollout of Aadhaar-based biometric ID, which I'll call this EPOS, which is a reference to the devices, the point-of-sale devices that they use for the authentication, for short, across 132 sub-districts. These are called blocks, in 10 districts, and we're going to look at the effects after around 6 to 8 months of rollout. So in these kind of large-scale rollout designs, one of the things that's often very important is that we want to be looking at the effects not of the first few months, which are typically going to be total chaos. We want to have some sense of whether we're looking at something that's more approximately the steady state impact of the thing. And so we'll look at the dynamics, but we feel pretty good about that. The reform we're looking at, which I'll walk you through in some detail, the kind of at a high level, the thing that's important is that this is pretty typical of the way Aadhaar is being deployed. So what you'd have to do if you want to collect your benefits under this new regime is first you'd have to get an Aadhaar number. Then you would have to seed it, which means that you link your Aadhaar number to your PDS account, to the record that says you're eligible for those benefits. And then finally, each time you show up to transact to collect benefits, you need to scan your fingerprints and authenticate biometrically. And in terms of the design, I'll get into this in more detail, but the things that are really important here, or 3 things that we think are really important, are dimensions in which we're able to run this experiment at very large scale. And so this is something that Karthik and I have been thinking and writing a little bit about, and Stefano edited this and gave us feedback on it. So we have this Journal of Economic Perspectives paper on this, on sort of what do we think are the costs and benefits of large-scale experimentation. So thank you, Stefano, for that. Part of what we think is important here is representativeness. A lot of development RCTs done in the last 20 years, which we're now justly celebrating with the Nobel Prize. But there's a concern that in many cases we're doing these in non-representative convenience samples. We're looking at the one place where there was an NGO that was ready to work with us or something like that. And so we worry that those results may not predict very accurately what would happen at larger scale. So that's one. So we're going to be looking at a sample that is by design representative of a sort of very large population that we care about, some of the poorest people in India. Second, we're going to be implementing the intervention at large scale. And so the reason this matters is that, again, if you test something at a small scale and potentially with an implementing partner like a really motivated NGO, things may look a lot better than they're going to look when you then scale it up and ask the government to implement the same thing with all the complicated logistical issues and incentive problems that come up at those scales. And so here we're looking at the actual policy that we care about, right? We're looking at the government doing what the government thinks it ought to do and asking what are the impacts of that. And then finally, we're going to be able to randomize the intervention in fairly large units. So these blocks that I mentioned here contain about 100,000 people and about 70 of these fair price shops. In this case, that's going to turn out not to matter very much, as it turns out. In some other experiments we've done, this was incredibly important, right? So there have been experiments where, the direct impact of the intervention the government introduced on beneficiaries and welfare programs was a very small part of the total story, and a big part of the total story was that markets moved, right? Wages went up by 5%, and that triggered an enormous redistribution from employers to employees. And so the ability to run experiments at scales, at market scales where you can see those kinds of effects is, I think, one of the things that's really exciting about this style of work. Yeah. Yeah, up to a certain quantity at a heavily subsidized price. Yeah, for both the food grains, most of what we're going to be looking at here is rice, and there's a bit of wheat. In both cases, the ration price is 1 rupee per kilogram, and the market price is around 20. So I'll give you kind of a preview of what we're going to find and then get into the details. So first, and I think when you kind of experiment at this kind of scale, this is in itself an important result, is that implementation here was actually relatively quick and thorough. And this came as a surprise to us because we've done closely related projects in some of India's better administered states in the past. Jharkhand is inarguably one of the worst administered states. I'll give you some numbers on that. And so I think one of the things we would have predicted coming into this new context is that it's going to be really difficult. They're not going to be very effective at rolling out. And in fact, that's not the case, right? So most people have an Aadhaar number that has been seeded to their ration account in the treatment group by the M-Line. And they report to us in about 90% of cases that the dealer at their ration shop is using one of these new EPOS devices to authenticate transactions by the time we get out. And by the way, that's fairly stable. We're going to look at a 3-month period, those 6 to 8 months. And so that's one of the reasons that we think we're looking at something that we could reasonably approximate a steady state, is because those numbers don't change very much at all. Second, in terms of impact, so we have one paper that some of you may have heard of that said that biometric ID is good, and here biometric ID seems to have had little impact, and where it did, the impacts that we detect are negative. So if we look at the value dispersed by the government, one of the rationales here is to try to save money, right? That didn't change. And actually that makes a lot of sense when you get into the details of it. So in some sense it's not a surprise. But value received by beneficiaries didn't change on average, right? And we can reject large changes here kind of in the value received. What does happen if you go down to the last point here is that for a subset of beneficiaries, for the people that did not have an Aadhaar number seeded to their ration card at baseline, you do see a significant drop, right? There's a bit of a drop on the extensive margin. There are about 2% of people who start getting no benefit at all. And at least in an accounting sense, that's fully explained by this subset of people that didn't have a seeded number at baseline. And for those people, there's a meaningful drop in the value that they get. There's also a small increase in transaction costs, so we're going to try to measure the time and money cost of people of collecting benefits. This isn't enormous, so this isn't going to end up being a huge part of your welfare calculus, which is one of the things that people sometimes allege, that this is just going to create massive queues and so forth. So, and you, Ted. Let me get into that. We're going to, at a high level, we're running a very large-scale experiment. So some districts or sub-districts are getting treated, some are not, and then we're running surveys in both and asking them questions about all these things. And then the more detail about what those questions were in the surveys we'll get to. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So we're sampling from the official beneficiary roster. So in that sense, they're entitled to benefits, right? There's been a process of determining who's eligible, and they've passed the bar. There's still an interesting question about the sort of the incidence across the income distribution, because what might happen is that these are kind of inferior goods that the government gives out, and that's part of, they're meant to be to some degree self-targeting. And so you might hope that what happens is if you introduce some minor hassle, like you now have to get Aadhaar if you want to get benefits, wealthier people are like, you know what, to get the crappy rice, it's just not worth it anymore, so I'm not going to bother. And so that could be a sort of positive, and that sadly does not seem to be the case. So unseated people at baseline are going to be lower income, less educated, that kind of stuff.
Reconcile this with the 43% leakage. Like, do you see what margin? Like, is that leakage still there, or can you detect this?
Yeah, this is so the 40% is nationwide in 2011 to 2012. In our control group, we're going to estimate more like 20 to 25%. We're not going to have an impact on that with this intervention, but give me one slide. Yeah? Okay. Good. So, what you've seen so far is, I think, kind of consistent with what a lot of the criticism of Aadhaar-based authentication has been, which is that it causes pain without gain. I think a legitimate counter-argument, if I were the government, is that what I've just described to you was kind of step one in a multi-step reform process that they wanted to roll out. And step two was a change in the protocol for dispersing grain. And this we're calling reconciliation. So I'll talk a bit more about what this means, but essentially what happened was that in the pre-Aadhaar days, if there were 100 people assigned to a fair price shop, the government would every month send 100 people's worth of rations to that fair price shop. And it would assume that it had all been distributed, right? Now for the first time, they're starting to get back data from these point of sale devices telling them how many people allegedly actually collected their benefits. And they're going to say, if I see in the data that you only distributed benefits to 70 people, then this month I'm only going to 70 people's worth of benefits, because you should still have the other 30 if you haven't stolen them, right? So they're going to start using those data to reconcile for the first time with the ration shop owners the shipments that they send to them. And we unfortunately didn't have the chance to run a separate experiment of this. We're going to run an event study and look at what happens in the time series. And we do have some ability to sort of placebo test this because reconciliation was applied to some commodities and not others. And so that gives us maybe a little bit of natural quasi-experimental control. But this mattered a lot. So when the government rolls out reconciliation, there's a sharp drop in the amount of grain it disperses. So value dispersed is going to fall by about 30%. And of this drop, about 2/3 is going to represent reduced leakage. The other 1/3 is going to represent reduced value received by legitimate beneficiaries in our data. One other thing we can do here, which is kind of interesting, it's perhaps a little bit tricky to explain until we get into the weeds a bit more, but we can ask using our experimental variation what would have happened if the government had implemented reconciliation but given everybody a clean slate, basically not held them responsible for their past arrears, which is what they did. And so one kind of policy recommendation that we're going to pull from this is that that looks to us like a more forgiving and more beneficiary-friendly policy than the one they actually implemented. Yeah, that's a good way to think about it for now. The reality is that there is a supply chain from the government warehouses through distribution networks down to the ration shop. And so we're not going to observe where exactly in that supply chain things go missing. It could be like at the ration shop. It could be higher up in the food chain. But somewhere in that process, someone's diverting the grain and probably selling it on the open market. Yeah. Yeah. So that's very much the way, it's interesting, when we talk to government officials, that's very much the way they think about it, that there are some honest guys and some dishonest guys. One of the things that we've been working on, which I'm not going to talk about today, is rolling out much higher frequency phone-based monitoring of a lot of this stuff. So India is now, kind of maybe like nationwide around 60-65% mobile penetration. And so you're starting to get to the place where a lot of these places you could very quickly and cheaply kind of measure who's getting what they're entitled to. And part of why we want to do that is exactly for this reason, to be able to quickly produce for the government scorecards that say, like, these are the 5 guys you need to call and harass. So we've tested this approach in some other states with some other programs where it's been like very, very cost effective because phone calls are cheap. I think it's really exciting. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So largely I'd say wait and let me explain it in more detail because the first 5 slides hard to get into sufficient detail. But essentially what the government did was they said, we're going to start reconciling going forward, and we're also going to hold you accountable for everything that's happened since we first gave you an EPOS device, right? So in some sense, these people had accrued a big debt by the time the policy was introduced, and that's part of the reason why we think a bunch of people lost access to their benefits because they had run up this deficit. Our point is that if you started everybody with a blank slate and said, as of today you have no deficit, but if next month we see that you haven't distributed everything, it'll start to accumulate. The data suggests that might have been given you a more advantageous trade-off between these errors of inclusion and exclusion. They also sell commercially, and that's a controversial thing. There are some people who think it's important that these things be run by community groups and only allowed to operate, and there are other people who think the only way it's going to be economically viable is if they can also retail. Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think that because the PDS stuff, comes in sort of identifiable packaging, it would be a little bit brazen to literally just move it over to the other shelf and sell it that way. You'd probably unpackage it and sell it somewhere else like that. But yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, and then the last thing we'll do, time permitting, is we'll also take a look at ration card deletion. So over time, the government, every year sort of eliminates some of these accounts, and some of that is just natural churn. People die, people move. You discover accounts that you decide are fraudulent and so forth. But there is a noticeable jump in the rate of ration card deletion, and indeed, when we look into it, that jump is entirely concentrated among the unseeded cards. And with our survey data, we're going to have some ability to say, is this deletion of cards of people who did not seed an Aadhaar account to their card, is it differentially targeting and eliminating the bad accounts, like the ghost accounts, that we wanted to get rid of, or is it actually hurting legitimate beneficiaries as well? And in fact, there are so few ghost accounts in our data, which is going to be one of the striking things, that we don't have a ton of precision to answer this. But I think the short answer is going to be that even though it does disproportionately find those guys, there are so few of them to begin with, that this is going to largely end up falling on legitimate beneficiaries as well. Okay. So the broad lessons, and I'll come back to these at the end just to give you a sense of what are we taking away from all of this. First is, I think, just having, providing the first experimental evidence on this basic question of, how do stricter ID standards affect errors of inclusion and exclusion. And I guess also just having the first experimental evidence on the impact of Aadhaar, which from a sort of technology for development perspective is, I think, kind of inarguably the biggest initiative on the planet today. So, by the way, this paper is currently in the comment period from the government. So by December 15th at the latest, we're allowed to actually release these results to the rest of the world. For those of you watching online. So, I think we're, all kind of like interested to hear what kind of feedback we get, because I think previous evaluations we've done, the results have largely been very positive, and this is probably the most negative set of results that we've delivered to date to our partners in the government. So we'll see how that goes. Two is, for those of you not kind of deep in the development literature, there's been just a boom in really high quality work on corruption in the last 15 years. A lot of it follows Ben Olken's pioneering work. And I think it's been great, and so we've learned a lot. But one thing that's interesting is that when you look at the way we think about costs and benefits in this literature, the costs of controlling corruption that I think have gotten the most emphasis have been direct costs, things like paying for audits. And those certainly matter. But if you go further back to a lot of the more descriptive work or the kind of conceptual work in the 80s, there's a lot of emphasis as well on sort of indirect costs, like ideas like if we create a lot of protocols to limit corruption, that's going to lead to worse decision making in other ways, right? We may not be able to buy things from the best vendor because, even though we know that guy's the best vendor, we actually have to run this really onerous procurement process and things like that. It's kind of one of the ideas like that from Wilson. And so here I think it's certainly the case that it's these indirect or shadow costs that are really the important ones. The costs of the device themselves are pretty negligible in this setting. And then third, there's this big discussion going on right now in development about how to think about external validity, right? Or how do we take the lessons from one study and apply them to somewhat different contexts. And this was a big one for us because, in fact, we debated whether to do this project at all because we had done this really great project on biometric ID in another state, and it seemed to work great. And we said, is this replication even worth our time? And I'm so glad that we did it. Some principles that I think we've been thinking about as a result of that. One is that this sort of notion of biometric ID as a black box, kind of the focus on the technology, would definitely have been a mistake, right? The design of the protocols around it, the specifics of like, if your thumbprint doesn't authenticate the first time, is there an override mechanism that lets you collect your benefits anyway? Those kinds of details, I think, mattered a lot. And by the way, I think those also very much reflect the political economy of the context in which this is happening. So Andhra Pradesh and Jharkhand had very different political incentives and objectives in rolling out this new technology, and you see that in the way they used it. And so then I think related to that, we think a lot about the context in which we roll things out. I think that the kind of construct, the notion of biometric ID as a black box, that would have been a big mistake if we had thought about it that way. Context is the thing I would have emphasized going in, right? I would have said that Jharkhand's a much worse governed state, and that's going to be the big issue, and I would have been wrong about that. Okay. How late do we go? Till 5? Oh, I see. All right. Well, so 5:30 total, but the last half hour, you guys want to do questions?
We can do flexible.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'll go pretty quickly then, and I apologize if it's too quickly. You can slow me down. And we'll see how far we get. Okay. So the PDS I've told you a little bit about. It's very big. It covers 75% of the rural population and 50% of the urban population under the recent National Food Security Act. And what we're looking at here, the introduction of EPOS devices into the PDS in Jharkhand, is something that's been happening nationwide. And it's also part of a broader push for what they call PDS computerization, right, which is digitizing a whole bunch of different aspects of the supply chain, the point of sale experience, all different aspects of PDS operation. Jharkhand, as I've told you, is a tough place to work. So I've given you some numbers here in terms of how it scores on sort of state performance indices that people produce and things like that. My preferred metric of this is that when we met with the government of Jharkhand, sort of the top 10 guys in the government use email, and everybody else uses paper. And even those guys that use email are probably going to have somebody print the email and bring it to them so that they can read it on paper. And so that starkly contrasts with Andhra Pradesh, which is the sort of a home to a booming tech sector, inarguably one of the best governed and best led states, or sort of best governed states. And that's where we had previously looked at the impacts of a separate biometric ID input. So let me walk you through the way authentication works in the old system in Jharkhand and then contrast that with what happened after the reform. So in the old system, you'd show up with your ration card, and the ration card would potentially have a photograph of the head of the household and a list of the people who are a member of the household, and then anybody who's listed there is legally entitled to show up and collect the benefits. And in practice, what you hear is that it was not at all uncommon for, send a friend or a neighbor if it's a small community and the ration shop owner knows who everybody is. Or in some cases, the ration shop owner might actually just keep all the cards with him because that would give him a fair bit of power. And so, you just show up and you'd say, okay, I know who you are, Ted, give you your benefits, things like that. In terms of record keeping and balance inquiry, people would keep their own paper ledgers. They were supposed to keep these, and they're also supposed to keep a record in your ration booklet that you bring with you. Practices varied a lot, and when you show up and ask people for records, sometimes you can find them, sometimes you can't, these sorts of things. And this is a picture to give you a sense of what that would look like. So this is a ration shop dealer who's making an annotation in somebody's ration card as they come in to collect their benefits. Here's what changed. So when they roll out Aadhaar-based biometric authentication, they give dealers these EPOS devices, and the devices can operate in one of three modes. So I'll explain online and offline, and then partially online just switches back and forth between the two modes depending on connectivity. So if you're in online mode, what happens is the operators first can enter the ration card number into the device, and then the device is going to say, here are all the people who have their Aadhaar number seeded to that card. Right? So if there's one person in our family who has seeded their Aadhaar number to the card, then that's the only person that collect the benefits. If all 5 of us say have, then any one of those 5 people could collect the benefits. So the operator says, this is the person who it is, and then the machine says, great, have that person scan their fingerprint. So they scan their fingerprint, and if it authenticates successfully with the central Aadhaar server, then the machine moves along and says, okay, great, you can collect their benefits. And there is a one-time password mechanism which is supposed to work. Anecdotally, we didn't hear of anybody actually using this, sort of successfully registering for and using this mechanism. But there is meant to be some degree of fallback in place. Offline machines don't do any authentication. So literally all they do is just capture the biometric information of the user. And the idea was that you could then later sync on a monthly basis that and do at least some checking of whether the right people were coming in. My sense is that no checking at all was done. And then partially online machines can switch back and forth depending on whether they're able to detect a cell signal. And all of this reflects the fact that this is like a weak connectivity environment, right? So the government is aware of this and they want to move to online, but they're also aware that in areas with really bad cellular reception, that's going to be a problem. By the way, so assignment to these modes was not random, so we're able to randomly assign the rollout of the overall approach, but not the specific method used. And so you should think about the treatment effects we're going to show you as a sort of a weighted average that reflects the assignment rule. In terms of balance keeping and record keeping, the machine is going to display your uncollected balance, including anything that you didn't collect last month. So there's meant to be a 1-month grace period, and say that's the maximum amount that you can actually collect. As we've been digging into the transaction level data, you can find examples of people who have collected like hundreds of tons of grain. So there is some sort of fail checking or some sort of of data validation that's not happening in the system in an interesting way. So that's something we're still digging into. But by and large, it's meant to allow you to transact up to your quota limit and not above that. And then in terms of record keeping, the system's going to keep a record. It's also going to print out a receipt, and it's supposed to read that receipt to you in Hindi. And these are transparency measures that are supposed to protect recipients, right? So that if the receipt says, you just received 10 kilos of grain, and I say, well, wait, I only received 2, you have some ability to say, this guy seems like he's trying to defraud me. Okay. This is training dealers on the use of the devices. So think of hundreds and thousands of these guys all across the state who are suddenly told they have to figure out how to learn this device in order to continue to operate their fair price shop. This is what authentication might look like in the field. So this is a dealer scanning somebody's thumbprint to authenticate them. And this is what the device itself looks like. So it's printed out a receipt at the top that says what this person has just purchased. And then what you see here in the display is the household roster. So it's giving you the list of people, it's giving you the last 4 digits of their Aadhaar number if it's been seeded, and it's showing you the one that's been selected to conduct the transaction. Before we look at the results, just to give you some sense of what we kind of expected this might do a priori. Not entirely clear, like when you think hard about it, how likely this is to actually help beneficiaries. So if you run through the issues that we think of as plaguing the PDS, one are these ghost beneficiaries, right? So people who just literally do not exist, right? That exist only on the muster rolls, and the benefits that are shipped to them just disappear somewhere into the corrupt ether. It could be helpful at preventing that if the government sort of noticed those people seem to not be collecting their benefits, and we're going to remove them from the list, right? So that's how you could imagine using the data from a device like this to tackle ghosts. Not clear that this is going to help with diversion from legitimate beneficiaries, right? And this is really one of the kind of core and important critiques. The government likes to gloss over this stuff at times. But if the problem was that I was showing up and I was supposed to get 10 kilos and you were only giving me 5, it's not clear that by scanning my fingerprint, I'm now going to get more than 5, right? And so it's not obvious that this, and if anything, it could go the other way, right? Which is that if I have some issue with authentication, if I'm not able to seed my card, the system doesn't work for me somehow, exclusion could actually get worse. Another issue, which is going to turn out to be not a huge issue here, but that can happen, is that dealers just, they give you what you're entitled to, but they cheat on the price margin, right? They charge you more than they're supposed to. Here I don't have a strong prior, but if anything, I would expect that dealers might demand a bit more to kind of help you navigate the system or make up excuses or stories based on the way the device is working. And then when you think about the kind of the more mechanical real transaction costs of collecting benefits, this I think could go either way, right? So you could tell a story that this is just a more efficient digital lookup system and that it's going to help. And you could tell a story that like half the time the electricity is going to fail or the connectivity is going to be out, things like that. And it's going to make it really painful for people to collect their benefits. So there isn't. There's the one-time password, right, which is that if it's not validating and you've linked your cell phone number to the system as well, you're supposed to be able to get that texted to you. Yeah. But that's an important point. So in Andhra Pradesh, a lot of the override mechanisms were much more flexible and forgiving. And a big part of that was because in Andhra Pradesh, the government rolled this out with a goal of improving the experience for beneficiaries. Right? That was the political play here. The political calculus was that cutting down on the corruption was going to piss some people off, but helping poor agricultural households was going to be worth it. Right? And here the calculus is very different. Right? The government of India is saying if you want to continue to receive your centrally sponsored subsidies, you need to do this. So to give you some sense of kind of the concerns and the criticisms people have had, here's Jean Drez, who's an economist and an activist, describing his concerns. And Jean is somebody that we speak to a bunch about this and ask for feedback on our survey instruments to make sure that we don't end up telling an overly rosy story. And Jean spends a lot of time on the ground, kind of going village to village and doing small scale and more descriptive work. And so, we don't know for sure if he's right or wrong before we start, but I have a lot of respect for his opinion. I also put in a quote here from one of the district collectors in Jharkhand. Right, the collector is the administrator responsible for a district. It's about 2 million people, making this basic point, right, saying that it's not clear how this is actually going to help poor people, since if you give me 2 kilograms of rice instead of 5, what can I do? Media coverage has also been really brutal. So, and we'll talk a bit more about this as we go, but to give you some sense, this is not typical of all media coverage, but this is also not like wildly atypical. This is the mom of a girl, an 8-year-old girl who died of starvation after not eating for 8 days, after her family stopped getting benefits for 5 months because they were not able to seed their ration card. And so, I show you this both to give you some sense of the political economy of the context, but also to remind you that when we look at impacts, the mean impacts may not really be the most important thing, right? The distributional impacts and the minority of people who really get hit hard may be the thing that really drives any sort of welfare calculus that we want to do at the end of the day. Okay. So as I said, we had the opportunity to run this large-scale experiment with the government of Jharkhand. I think I've shared these numbers with you already. The one thing I'd say is there are 24 districts in the state, and we got to sample from 17 of those. There were 7 that were off limits because they were rolling out a separate reform, DBT for kerosene, which we think potentially interacts with or compounds this, and so we wanted to stay clear of those. So we know that we're going to be in a statistical sense at least representative of those 17, and we'll also look on demographic characteristics, how well we compare to the rest of the state. This is what this looks like on a map. Give you a sense. So we have nice geographic coverage in the sense that we have most of the regions of Jharkhand. And then here are those representative statistics. So I'm showing you in the first column the 10 districts that we chose to study, and then in the second column the 14 that we did not. 7 of those 14 were sampled out, so statistically speaking they should look the same. The other 7 were selected out for a different reason, and so they don't necessarily look the same. But what this table is telling you is that on a lot of these core characteristics, we do look pretty good, right? So we feel pretty good that we're representative of the state of Jharkhand. Next thing we're going to do here is check whether randomization worked, right? Whether the treatment and control subdistricts or blocks look similar on a bunch of these characteristics. And so generally good news here is that they do on a bunch of these things. And so I won't spend a lot of time on this in the interest of time. Sort of let me give you first a sense of the first stage, right? We assigned some of these areas to get Aadhaar early. What impact did that have on what actually happened at the fair price shop? First, about 78% of ration card holders had at least one member seated to begin with. So actually, this is like a reasonably high seating environment to start with, which is a good thing. For those who didn't yet have an Aadhaar number seated to their ration card, what they would have had to do is go to either the district officer, or more common, there's someone called a village level entrepreneur who would be designated to kind of provide enrollment services they'd go to, and then get an Aadhaar number, and then to get it seated, they would need to go to the district office to make that connection, right? So it's a fair bit of legwork. Like going to the district office could be like a day or two of travel for somebody in this context. Nevertheless, by the time we come out and do our first online survey, 97% of households in treatment and 93% of households in control say that they have at least one member of their household with their Aadhaar number seated to their ration card. So this seems like something that was hard work, but something that people took seriously and for the most part were able to do. And in terms of the numbers, about 3.5 out of 4 people on a typical ration card would have successfully seeded their Aadhaar number to the card, right? And the reason that potentially matters a little bit is that, if in the old days you had a lot of flexibility to send whoever wasn't doing anything else or didn't have a high opportunity cost of time, now you may have a little bit less flexibility. You may need to send the person who's been seeded. Fraction of households in the population? 75% in rural areas and 50% in urban areas. It was sort of more in the sort of 40, I think it was like 40 to 45% pre-2013. And then in 2013, the National Food Security Act substantially expanded eligibility and also redefined categories. Yeah, so the number we've calculated here is that in our sample, the entitlement of the average household is going to be about 15% of the rural poverty line. So substantial. The other one, I should get sure, in aggregate, this program is 1% of GDP. Okay. So here's the difference between treatment and control box in terms of some of these measures of implementation. Like, did the dealer have an EPOS machine? Were they using it in January, February, March, the 3 months that we're going to ask about in our first end line? And so you see that we're kind of up at around 90 to 95% on these measures of implementation in the treatment group. There are a few guys in the control group who also say these things are happening. There are a couple of villages where treatment did actually roll out early, so there was like some very slight non-compliance with the design. And I think there's also just some degree of confusion about what these things actually are. There's certainly some measurement error when we ask households, like, they don't know what an EPOS device is, and we have to explain to them what we mean by that. Okay. We're going to draw data from a bunch of sources, so administrative records on what prices should have been, who the eligible beneficiaries were, how much grain the government dispersed and other commodities to a bunch of these places. And then a lot of the legwork that we do here is the original household surveys. So we're going to draw a ration card level panel, right? Which means we're going to sample a bunch of households, about 4,000 of them, and then go back in each of 4 rounds, baseline and 3 end lines, to try to find the same households and measure outcomes, focusing on what benefits they actually get from the PDS shop. We're going to be focusing here mainly on measuring the value that they actually received, quantities, quality, prices, and so forth. And we'll also look a little bit at measures of food security, nutrition, things like that. Although that's not going to be the emphasis here. We also collected data from the fair price shop dealers themselves. So there are a couple of things that will be interesting coming out of that. We started with a sample of 370 of these guys, and then we pick up a few more. And the reason we do is because there's some churn of people moving between fair price shops over time. So about 8% of our sample of households will get reassigned to a different fair price shop between baseline and end line. And so we're also going to pick up the new fair price shop owners to whom they get assigned. Right. So that's a great question. Kind of in the kind of totality of things the government does is a huge list, right? I told you that as of 2017, there were like 550 schemes, right, that had started doing this. In terms of things that would be directly relevant for kind of a guy, like a poor guy in rural Jharkhand, not a lot that I'm aware of. It'd be good to do like a full audit of that and just make sure there's nothing. You saw that. Yeah, exactly.
That would directly affect living.
That's right.
That would be the one that I would.
Yeah, that's a good. I should do the full list. I mean, the differences in sort of Aadhaar ownership rates are quite slight. I don't know if you saw, it's 97 versus 93 in treatment versus control. And then we're not going to see impacts on all that stuff, so it'd be like a fairly convoluted story, I think. But that's the right question. Yeah. Okay. So I want to just kind of show you all in one place the timeline, both of the interventions and of data collection. So the top panel here shows you the interventions. First, the rollout of the biometric authentication in the treatment blocks and then in the control blocks. And then the onset of reconciliation. And reconciliation only lasts here for 4 months because it turned out to be such a political and a media disaster that they were able to get permission to roll it back after 4 months. And they've since reinstated it, so it has come back again since then. But it was a bad 4 months. We're going to collect data from the 4 surveys I mentioned, baseline and then 3 end lines. And we did 3 end lines here because we want to construct a panel, sort of a monthly time series of benefits received for each household. And we don't want to ask people things that happened 10 months ago, right? So we're going to go out regularly and ask them about the last 3 to 5 months to try to minimize the damage from recall issues. We have transaction level data from every fair price shop where transactions are being recorded in these EPOS devices, which is nice. And then we're going to use disbursements. We're going to use records, digital records maintained by the government, by the central government of disbursements. We did also actually go out to a bunch of block go-downs and warehouses and collect their records directly, which tend to be kind of patchy, so they're a bit less complete. But to the extent we can, when we check the 2 things, they're generally pretty correlated, and the results I'm going to show you are going to be qualitatively the same if I use those records instead. But we're going to use the digital records because we have those comprehensively. So the first thing we can do with the data is just simply categorize households, right? One of the key questions is you have 4,000 households that are supposedly in the data. Do they actually exist in the real world? And so the way we're going to do this is, we're going to go out and try to find these people 4 times, and then we're going to look across all those visits and say, did we ever find you? And survey you. In that case, we know that you exist. It might still be that you exist, but you're sort of what we'd call like a quasi-ghost. Like you're like a real household, but you've never heard of this program, never participated in it, and so like it'd be like Ted being enrolled in the PDS, right? He would be obviously someone has put his name in there, but is then diverting his benefits. And then we're interested in how many people literally don't exist. And the problem here is we have to be careful because sometimes people do exist, but it's hard to find them. And so we have a sort of protocol for this where we require that at least 3 other households verify the status. If they say this person never existed or this person moved away or so forth. And so if we can meet that standard, then we say we've proved this person just does not exist in the relevant time frame. And if we can't, we say we don't know. Right? So that's our categorization. Here's how that breaks down in the data. So of the 4,000 people we sampled, we're going to survey at some point almost all of them. And a few of those are people who say we've never heard of this, we don't have a ration card, any of that stuff, but most of them do. And then of the ones that we don't find, we're going to say with confidence that 1.5% of those guys are ghosts. They just simply don't exist. And another 1.5% we're not totally sure. Right? But so even if you take the worst case scenario, this is saying that only 3% of the guys in this data seem to be ghost households. And that's really important because, it's good news, first of all. That's not the operative margin here for leakage. But it's also important because this is one of the problems that biometric ID is relatively well suited to addressing. And it's not actually the problem that Jharkhand is having, if that makes sense. Okay, so for econometric estimation, we're going to use a fairly simple specification, right? We're just looking here at reduced form intent to treat effects. A few things to note. So we're going to have fixed effects for the strata within which we randomized. There's a few strata of size 1, and so they're all going to get a single fixed effect. Where we have the baseline value of the outcome, we'll include that as a control. We have some variation in sampling probabilities. That reflects field logistics. So it's the sort of thing where a team can survey 10 people in a village per day. And so in larger villages, we're going to sample a smaller proportion of the village. And so weighting by those inverse sampling probabilities lets us recover representative estimates. One decision we had to make here was what to do with the sort of 3 months of data we get from our first end-line survey, which is where we look at the experimental impacts. And so we didn't know going in whether things would have stabilized by then or whether there would be important dynamics in those treatment effects. So what we said we would do in our pre-analysis plan is that we would look at across all the main outcomes and ask if there's evidence of sort of time variation in the effects. And if there was, we would report specifications that revealed that. And if there wasn't, we would just report the pooled estimates, right? And so as it turns out across all these things, we're never going to find any evidence of significant trends or month-to-month variation in the effects. And so I'm just going to be showing you pooled estimates throughout, but the rest of the stuff is all in the paper if you're interested in that. Standard errors are going to be clustered at the level of unit of randomization, and we're going to, in some cases, break things out across commodities. So there are 5 commodities, and so in those cases, within outcome but across commodities, we'll also show you Q values, which control the false discovery rate, which I actually don't think is the right thing to do, but we said we would do it, so there you go. we, I think I didn't put it in here, Ethan, so I'm sorry for that. We stratified based on a couple of basic measures of sort of PDS penetration, like the share of people who are eligible for the PDS, and I think we also included some basic demographic stuff like literacy and so forth that went into the stratification. But I should have that in here, and I need to go back and double check. That's right, yeah, exactly, yeah. Okay. So, I think I'm going to skip over details of things like how we constructed our measure of value. It's basically price times quantity in the interest of time, and because I realize you guys want to be able to ask more questions. And I'll just start showing you some of the results. So this is the impact on value received by the average beneficiary. A couple of things to note here. So the average entitlement value down here in the descriptive stats table, that's 600 rupees per household per month, and so that's the figure that we talked about earlier. That's about 14% of the rural poverty line. The control mean value received, you can see, is about 20–25% lower than that, right? So that difference there is mean leakage in our control group. And then the treatment effect here is very, very small. The one thing that is potentially going on here is you see there may be a little bit of substitution from wheat and towards rice. And I think that's actually a real thing. So by law, what's meant to happen in Jharkhand is that rural areas get all rice and urban areas get rice and wheat in a 3:2 ratio. But then there are a bunch of these ad hoc exceptions that people make for areas that say they really want some wheat, things like that. And so I think that this intervention led to reduced flexibility to make those exceptions when you look at the data. That wasn't a stated policy, but when you look in the data, that seems like something that happened. But the bottom line is here, there's just very little going on in terms of average value received. By the way, one of the reasons, you see that baseline lag is quite predictive for all these except sugar and salt. Sugar and salt get rolled out. They typically, instead of doing them monthly, we'll do them like every 2 or 3 months to minimize transaction costs. And so there's much less autocorrelation in that for that reason. Okay. If I look at the underlying prices and quantities, kind of, is there anything funny going on here? There's, again, nothing going on, nothing significant in terms of quantities received. In terms of the market prices that I'm using to calculate my measure of value received, again, not much going on except that maybe the price of sugar fell by a little bit. I don't have a story for why that would be the case, so I don't know if that's a real thing or not, but very little of that. People often worry that the goods they get through the ration shops are of low quality. This could mean that the grain was left to rot for a while, or it could mean that the dealer adulterated it by adding gravel or adding water to the kerosene or things like that. So we have questions. These are just self-reported perceptions of these things being issues. In general, we're not seeing much change here, except maybe there's an impact on people's issues with salt or with adulteration. And then when we look at measures of food security, kind of not surprisingly, given what we've seen so far, we're going to see very little change here. So these are standard World Food Program measures. I think the way to think about magnitudes here is these both of these treatment effects, the confidence intervals are going to be around sort of plus or minus 0.1 standard deviations for this population. So those are the effect sizes that we're rolling out here, right? They're not big. Okay. So what happened to leakage? The way to think about leakage is there's sort of 2 margins of it, right? There's a price margin and a quantity margin, and so we want to look at both of those things. The way we're going to look at quantity is we're going to try to take advantage here of the fact that we have data on value received for this sample of people, but data on value dispersed for everybody. And so the way we're going to effectively do that is by collapsing things to block level values, and then look at those block level values within our sample, to whom we can actually compare those to value received, if that makes sense. Here are the impacts on value dispersed. So there's actually, if anything, a small increase in the kind of estimated value that the government dispersed to the average household in this sample. You can see the main thing that's really happening is, again, this shift from dispersing wheat to dispersing rice. I think some of the increase in value dispersed is just compositional there. It's the price of rice was slightly higher than the price of wheat. That doesn't fully explain the increase, though, of 12 rupees, right? But so if the government's goal here was to save money by reducing disbursements, it did not do that here, at least with this initial intervention. And then given that, not surprisingly, this is the impact on leakage. So again, we're going to be able to rule out changes here more than sort of plus or minus around 5 to 8 percentage points, right? So this there can't have been a very big reduction in leakage as a result of this. This is the price margin. So did dealers charge people more for what they got than they were supposed to? This doesn't seem to be a huge issue, right? So the mean household reports getting charged prices that are 8 rupees higher than what they should have paid for the bundle of commodities they got. And again, that's not changing significantly because of treatment. if I look at the time and money cost to people of collecting their benefits, for the government, we can't disaggregate this, so I can't show you a treatment effect. I can tell you what the government spends in total on administering this, this program per ration card in the state, but I can't tell you if it changed differentially because they don't report disaggregated data. For dealers, we have their reports of the direct costs, so what it costs them to like acquire and retail PDS grains. So this is an underestimate of their total cost because it doesn't include shared things like, you know, if they're renting a building, for example, they're using both for PDS and also for commercial activity. We can't see those shared costs, but those are unlikely to change. So this is also probably a pretty good estimate of the treatment effect, if not at the level. And then for beneficiaries, you do see this increase, and it's not a huge increase, but it's around 7 rupees per household per month, so that's not a ton of money. But to give you a sense of where that's coming from, if I break out the underlying variables that we use to calculate that, these, by the way, are not additive, right? So you have to add some and multiply some to get the number I showed you on the previous slide. But the things that seem to be changing here are that people take a few more unsuccessful trips, and also that the opportunity cost of the person they send to get the grain goes up by a bit, which I think is kind of consistent with this idea that you have a bit less flexibility to send the person you want to. Okay. So the heterogeneity is what ends up being really important. So let me just show you distributionally. This is the distribution of value received as a proportion of the value to which you are entitled for the treatment group and the control group. And by the way, one thing to note here is that I've cut off a very few people in the very right tail of this distribution. So there are some people who collect more than 100% of the value they're entitled to in a given month. A lot of that is just because you're entitled to catch up on backlog if you didn't purchase your full entitlement the month before. Some of it is also because of this bunching of sugar and salt. So in some months you might get like 3 months worth of sugar entitlement and so forth. But in any case, I've chopped those guys off of here. And so what you see is that these two things are very similar, except that down here in the left tail there seems to be a bit of a gap. And so if I look here at the extensive margin directly, if I look at the outcome here as an indicator for did you get any of this thing or did you get any value at all, you see there's this marginally significant drop, right? About 2 percentage points fewer people who get any value at all from the PDS in a given month. So we wanted to drill into this because this is the thing that I think potentially really drives the welfare consequences of the intervention. And so here we look at this split I mentioned by whether or not you had at least one member with an Aadhaar ID seeded to your ration card at baseline, right? And so here's where you see a really stark difference, right? That for the minority, this is about 20% of households that did not. You see a significant reduction in the value they get. You see that the share of them who get anything drops by about 10 percentage points. That 10 percentage points times the 20% who didn't have it seeded works out to around 2. So at least in an accounting sense, this is fully explaining that extensive margin effect that I just showed you previously. And all these things are significantly different between the two groups. Yeah? So this is consistent, I think, with the sort of Genre's view of the world, that, you know, for most people, they're going to find a way to make this work, but for a minority of people who don't, this could actually be quite costly, quite harmful. I'll skip this one because you guys want to get to questions, is that right? Okay. I'm happy to try to adjust the format, and I'm also happy for you guys to interrupt me as I go. So, okay. So as I said, this intervention on its own I think is important. It was also, you know, in the government's point of view, a first step towards a second reform, which is reconciliation. And so as I said to you earlier, before the rollout of EPOS devices, their policy was to disperse in each month the full entitlement to which households linked to a fair price shop were entitled. And after July 27, in both treatment and control groups, the government stopped doing that, and they started saying, I can see in the transaction data how much you're meant to get, and so I'm going to give you that month. So the way I think about this from the dealer's point of view is that there are sort of two separate effects that are interesting. There's a retrospective effect, which is because I have accumulated a deficit, I'm now going to get less grain today. And then there's also a prospective or incentive effect, which is as I think about whether to record that I dispersed grain to TED, I know that if I record in the device that I did, I'm going to get more grain next month, right? So it creates a positive incentive to at least report that you have dispersed grain. Right? Importantly, it doesn't necessarily create an incentive to actually disperse grain, right? And anecdotally, a lot of times what would happen is the dealer would say to you, look, I don't have anything to give you, but if you don't scan your fingerprint, we're not going to get anything next month either, right? So just scan your fingerprint and say that you got your full allotment, because then at least next month I'll have something, right? So note that difference. In terms of the impacts we think this ought to have or might potentially have, you know, here's where I think you could potentially get some real bite, but also some trade-offs. So it should be very hard to kind of consistently send grain to ghosts in this system, because if you keep doing it, they're not going to scan their fingerprints, and you're not going to get any credit for it, and so over time, your balance should get drawn down. Diversion from real recipients is hard to say, right? So they should have more leverage here, because I can say, if I don't scan my fingerprint, you're not going to get any grain next month, so you better give me some grain. But on the other hand, if the dealer just simply doesn't have any stock because he's being penalized for his past sins, you might get nothing, right? So this one's really ambiguous, and I think important to estimate. Same thing for overcharges. And then transaction costs, I don't have a strong prior that this would change in either direction. So we didn't have an experiment here, and so the way we approach this was to say we're going to look at a time series, and we're going to pre-specify the functional form we're going to try to fit to it, and then we'll look at it, and you can tell us if we did a good job or not. And we do also have this placebo group, right? The commodities that were not subject to reconciliation that we can compare to. So the way we said we do this is we'll have a time trend, because we expect there's probably going to be some things that change over time. We said we'll have an indicator. This is the RT term here for the onset of reconciliation. And we'll also allow the effects of reconciliation to change over time. Doing the latter definitely hurts us here in terms of precision, because we're estimating not a lot of effects from a few months of data. But everything we know both theoretically and from the context is that these effects are probably not going to be the same, right? You'd expect there to be trends and dynamics to them. And then we're essentially not going to use the last month in our data, November, to help pin this down. So I'm including an indicator for November on its own. If I took that out, then I'd get a lot of additional power, because I'm saying things have to revert exactly to trend once reconciliation ends. But we didn't feel like that was a kind of plausible assumption or restriction to impose ex ante, so we did not do that. Okay, so the dots here are the actual raw data, the monthly series, and then the lines are the fitted relationship. And so we feel good that we actually ended up guessing reasonably well with the specification and fitting this quite well. What you see is that for the unreconciled commodities, which are the black line, those make up a relatively small share of value received, right? So think of them as a control group with a grain of salt. But really not much happening, right? So when you hit this reconciliation period, if anything, it seems like maybe the government or people are getting a little bit more of those, but not much. There's a bit of a downward drift here, and that's driven by sort of lower frequency of salt and sugar disbursements over time. And I don't have a kind of a story or a reason for why that would be the case, but that is what's driving that. What's happened with the reconciled commodities, as you can see, is that there's this sharp initial drop, right? This is going to fall by about 30%, and then a rebound, right? It goes back up pretty quickly. So keep that in mind. Here's what this looks like in regression format. Everything in here is like really significant because we just have tons and tons of data, right? So the stars really are not the important thing. The magnitudes are the important thing. And so again, you're seeing here that for unreconciled commodities, things don't change very much. But for the reconciled commodities, there's this big initial drop, right, of about 150 rupees per ration card per month. And then after 3 months, that effect is totally wiped out. Here's what happens to value received. So the same figure, but now looking at the household survey data. And so what we see is, again, that for non-reconciled commodities, it seems like not that much changes. For reconciled commodities, again, there's a drop, not as pronounced a drop, right? And so quantitatively, what that looks like is about 2/3 of that initial drop I showed you is a change in leakage, and about 1/3 it shows up here as a reduction in value received by their students. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. No, you're seeing exactly that, right? So the value dispersed drops fairly precipitously in July. Yeah. Yeah. And then over time it starts to go. So that's exactly the right intuition. And then the kind of puzzling or interesting thing is, why exactly does it go back up over time, right? And so I think part of that is that dealers figured out the right way to game the system by, say, having you scan your fingerprint and pretend. And part of it is anecdotally that there was just enormous pushback and a lot of exceptions and waivers being granted, which ultimately culminated in the government waiving the policy entirely. Okay. All right, value received, I've shown you. So now one thing we can do, which is nice, so we don't have an experiment here, but we can cut the time series by our experiment. And the reason that's a relevant thing to do is remember that part of what hit guys in July was this arrears they had accumulated. And if you were in the treatment group, you'd been accumulating that arrears for about 10 months. If you were in the control group, you'd only been accumulating that arrears for about 1 month. So that stock effect, right, is actually much bigger for people that we randomly assigned to treatment than it was for the people we randomly assigned to control. And so here I've split those two things out. And so you see, first nicely you see that for the unreconciled commodities, being assigned to treatment had no effect. But for the reconciled commodities, you see, right, that the drop is sharper for the people who were in the treatment group, right? So they had accumulated a bigger debt, and they had to pay for it more severely in July. So the thing we think is interesting about that is there's a policy question of what would happen if you had zero debt, right? This is what I called a blank slate reconciliation policy, which would have been an alternative and somewhat more forgiving policy that the government could have introduced. And so what we're essentially going to do is use this experimental variation to try to estimate what that would have been, right? What would the effect if we extrapolate out to zero have looked like? This is value received, right? Same pattern. And so that's what we're doing in this table. So here I'm interacting the onset of reconciliation with your balance when reconciliation began, and I'm instrumenting for your balance when reconciliation began with assignment to treatment, right, to try to identify that piece of the puzzle. And so the way I read this is that if you get rid of the terms interacted with balance, right, if you set balance to zero, then in that first month you do get a drop in value dispersed, but you don't get a drop in value received, right? So there you potentially could have had something for nothing. In the sense that you could have reduced exclusion error without hurting legitimate beneficiaries. There's a bit of an extrapolation involved here, right? So the mean in the sort of control group, I think their balance was 32% on average of the balance in the treatment group. It wasn't zero, right? So I don't actually have data points at zero where I can see what happened. But if I make that extrapolation, I can give you a prediction of what it would have been like. Okay. Last data point on this that I think is kind of interesting is that when we did our first round of surveys, we asked dealers what their sort of expected future plans were and what they thought it would cost to be a PDS dealer. A lot of times the rents that these guys extract end up trickling back up through the administrative hierarchy because they have to pay for licenses and pay to operate and so forth. And these are sensitive questions, and not everybody's going to answer them, so you have to treat them with a grain of salt. You can see here that not everybody did. But the thing that's interesting here is that even in the first end line, right, before we'd seen any impact on leakage, you can see people saying that they think that the cost of a bribe to obtain a PDS dealer license is going to drop by a lot, right? So what that suggests to me is that they had some sense that reconciliation was coming, and they had some, at least a broad sense, like an idea that the government was cracking down and that things were going to get worse, and that you see that starting to get priced in to their expectations. Sorry, that is expected in the, what do I anticipate in the future the bribe will be? Yeah, the bribe amount. Not do I think there will be. Well, it's in rupees. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so it's, I mean, divide by 60 roughly. So it's it's like $1,000. I don't think there are a ton of zeros actually, but yep. Okay. Just a couple of, so we also asked people kind of whether they like this thing, and we asked this both of households and of dealers. And so, there are a couple of things here. I would just focus on the top panel, just in the interest of time. There are a couple of things that I think are worth highlighting here. One is that kind of reception of this is very polarized, right? So people tend to have strong views one way or the other. They really like it or they really hate it. The second is, and this is sort of a thing that's surprising, is that like a lot of people do express support for it, right? Around half of the people in this sample, despite the fact that there are no obvious winners, right, anywhere in the data that I've shown you so far, you have half of the people saying that they like this and they think it's a good thing. And what I hear from people when I ask, and I don't speak Hindi, so I don't ask people directly, but I think what the team will say is that people say, look, it's kind of a pain in the ass, but at last the government is finally doing something about the PDS, is sort of the view. And so I think an important part of the context here, and this is more qualitative, but part of what I think the Modi administration, and some of us were talking about this earlier today, part of what I think the administration has been brilliant at is getting people to be willing to incur these personal costs because they see it as something that's good and necessary for the rest of the country, right? And that really seems to be consistent with what we see in the table and the kind of color that you hear from people around that. It's not, in fact, that people felt like they're better off personally because of this. It's just they're frustrated that the thing has been broken for such a long time. And they're glad that somebody is finally doing something about it, even if they have to deal with some short-term pain because of that. This is line 1, yeah, which is a good question. The other thing that I think is kind of interesting to think about here is the sort of the role of different pieces of the institutional apparatus, right? So if you were to have a vote on whether to have biometric authentication, you could probably get a majority for it. The people who really got hurt seem to be a very small minority, right? And so I think when you think about the institutional design problem, that also kind of reminds us, or at least suggests, that there's an important role for institutions like courts, for example, that are going to protect the rights of a minority, even if a majority are happy with the change like this. Okay, so let me show you ration card deletion, and then I'll be done, and we can do more questions. So as I said to you earlier, there's some degree of this every year anyway, so about 2% of ration cards get deleted. and that spiked up during 2014 to 2016. 2016 to 2018, and so we wanted to dig into that and understand what the government was doing. According to official government policy, they were not deleting unseated cards, right? So none of what I'm about to show you actually happened. So on the top panel here, we have administrative data. So this is the universe of cards, and we can see which at the beginning of this period were seeded and which were unseeded, and then we can see at the end of this period which no longer are there in the data set, right? So we can see what the change was. And so you can see here, as I said, that there is this differential uptick, right? That unseeded cards are much more likely to get deleted during this period than seeded cards. And in fact, that explains the full uptick, right? So the deletion rate among the unseeded cards is still 2%, which is pretty similar to the rate in the preceding 2 years. But among the unseeded cards, it's much higher. It's 36%. So then what we do in the second panel is we go to our survey data, and the big advantage of our survey data is that we can say which of these households were real households and which of them were ghosts, right? Because part of the point of deletion is meant to be to get rid of the fake households. And you've already seen that there are very, very few ghosts, and that in some sense is going to end up being the story here. But a few more things that you can see here are that the unseeded cards are differentially likely to belong to ghosts, right? So it is true in some sense that if you delete those cards, you're more likely to be deleting a ghost than if you delete a typical card, right? So there is some information content in there that is potentially helpful to the government. But the other thing you see here, again, is that because there are so few ghosts, right, deleting those unseeded cards, you're still going to end up, for the most part, deleting cards that belong to real households, right? Which is what happened, and probably what happened to the mother in the picture that I shared with you earlier. Okay, well, thank you for being really flexible on format. I guess that was a little bit different from the way you guys typically like to run things, but I hope it was informative. And we do have 10 minutes left, so I'll kind of leave up here the broader lessons that we thought we'd take away from this and spend the rest of the time on discussion, however you'd like to use it. Yep, all right.
We'd like people to ask the questions in the mic since we're recording this. So, does anyone have questions?
I'm just knowing the previous paper, Paul, and like the different results from the, the earlier study and this study. We talk a lot about external validity. There's this huge effort now. Kenya, East African countries are just going through all this stuff like right now, and it's a huge issue. Like, what's your very high level takeaway with two studies with very different results? What can explain the difference? Like the basic sort of institutional quality measures don't seem to explain it. Like, if the government of Tanzania or Kenya comes to you and says, we want to do Aadhaar Light, like what, I'm just curious, what would your policy recommendation be, or what are the key issues that we still need to study to understand when there would be positive impacts or negative impact? I would like to, since you know this area very well, like what's your high level take?
Yeah. I mean, I think to me it's very much who in the government is coming to us and asking, right? So it's very much political economy. The context in Andhra Pradesh is that, there were, historically, political actors in Andhra Pradesh had gotten a lot of money from other sectors, from mining, from construction, and there was political will at the highest levels in the government to try to clean up the welfare state because they thought it would be a political winner. And so they really went in with the goal of, like, let's make things better for the pension beneficiaries and the NREGS beneficiaries. And that was reflected in the way biometric was deployed and the protocols, all that kind of stuff. And to some extent in the fact that, like, in Andhra Pradesh, like, when we did our RCT after 2 years, only 50% of the payments had been converted to the new system, I think is in part reflective of this, that they were very reluctant to push it too hard if there was any risk that it was going to hurt real beneficiaries. And then in Jharkhand, the political context is just very different, right? The central government is saying this, you have to do this if you want to keep getting transfer payments. And Jharkhand, they ended up asking for a reprieve, for the ability to roll it back because, there was creating such an uproar, and as you can see, it didn't seem like anybody was benefiting. So, I think I don't want to be repetitious, but I think it's that point about, the details of how the technology gets used are very important, and they're going to reflect the incentives in the environment in which it gets deployed.
State in the sense that there are some Maoist-related issues, violences, which have been different parts of Jharkhand has been affected by it. Yep. So, do you have some heterogeneity tests on the basis of whether blocks have been affected by Maoist violence or not?
Yeah, it's interesting. So when I showed you that there are a few people that we're not able to track down, a lot of that will be because we hit an area that's like Naxal affected, and we're not able to send our teams in there. It's not safe, things like that. So I know that there is a small minority of our sample that was like so affected that we weren't even able to talk to them. It's a fair question, if there are other sort of other kind of affected but less affected areas where we do have data that we could say something about. So yeah. I'm curious if there's anything specific, if you have a thesis.
So think of the exclusions that you have seen in your results. So are those exclusions driven by regions which are more affected by the Naxalite movement? So it sort of goes on to say that, the Andhra Pradesh Jharkhand comparison that you're drawing, there is improved state capacity on the part of Andhra Pradesh, but not so much in Jharkhand. However, is that in part driven by the Naxal violence?
It's interesting. I don't know, but it's interesting. Thank you.
Sure, I just had, coming maybe back to Ted's question of the policy implications. So it seemed like one of the things was, is there a way to make seeding easier, right? So, so it didn't take 2 days to travel to where you needed to do it. So if you had to think about how you could do that so fewer people fell through the cracks.
Yeah. I think there are a few things that, and some of these we're doing, and some of these would be wonderful if somebody else would do. Certainly there are like mechanical things you could do to make that process easier. Let the village level entrepreneur, enable them to perform more of those functions, things like that. I also think a big thing is it's not obvious that you need to authenticate every transaction, right? Because authenticating a transaction doesn't really help you with kind of this problem of, I just didn't get my full entitlement. I think a policy of saying requiring people to authenticate, once a year, or maybe once every 5 years when you reestablish eligibility for the program in the first place, that could help get you a lot of the mileage you want in terms of getting rid of entirely fake people without creating all this additional risk of exclusion. And then the last thing, and this is something that we are actively doing, is I think that building mechanisms to systematically and regularly measure whether people are getting what they're meant to get so that the feedback loop is tighter would be really valuable. And so that's why some of the phone-based stuff I talked about, the government typically has to wait. They have to wait several years for us to do this, and you guys vet it, and then we finally come back to them with the results. Or for a lot of these things, for example, I showed you the last nationwide leakage numbers come from the 2011 to 2012 National Household Survey. That's just like way too low frequency and way too low granularity to be useful for management purposes. So having higher frequency data on things like, this month in this district, 20% of people didn't get their entitlement, I think is a really valuable lever.
You largely just addressed my question. I was going to ask about sort of, on the one hand, recourse, like the tragic case of the woman who didn't get the payment, like what recourse do they have? And then second, like a lot of the narrative you see also around these massive digitization programs is like increasing legibility and all the data-driven analytics you can do, and in particular if that might interact, right? If you can think of, like, aside from doing like other interventions to survey people, like ways to use the data to identify where the problems might be most severe.
Yeah, so I'll go in reverse order. I think the second one, I don't know what information content there is in all the transaction data. That's really the new source of like rich, high-frequency data. And so, that would be an interesting exercise, right, to kind of squeeze it and see what comes out. So I don't know. The first one, I think this is one of the sad things about a lot of these issues in India, which is that on paper, there's always recourse, right? There's always a hotline that you can call. There's always, a way to escalate it through the administrative hierarchy. And then if you look at the numbers, like the PDS hotline, for example, they're like mind-blowing. Like apparently like 1,000 people a year call the PDS hotline in all of India, right? And people just don't think it's going to do anything, and they're probably right. And so part of the reason we've been pushing more of this outbound is, call people proactively and figure out what's going on, is that I think people have become very cynical and skeptical about these things. And I think if you want to know what's going on, it's easy to throw up and say, well, we have a hotline, and if there were problems, people can call us anytime. But I think if you really want to know, you have to do it proactively. Okay, thank you.